Right, hi everybody, welcome back. This should be my final video on topic 7, or more specifically topic 7.3, which I hope you remember was called Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation. And in this one I want to look quite quickly at a few international efforts or international cooperation to deal with both mitigation and adaptation. All of the things I look at were really part of the United Nations or United Nations agreements. And the 5 things that I want to look at, you'll see above my head. The first 2 were international agreements. First of all, the Kyoto Protocol of 1997, which was followed by the Paris Agreement or the Paris Accord in 2015. And then the other 3 are international or United Nations bodies or agreements that also deal with this question. So I want to look at the IPCC, NAPAs, and the UNFCCC. Okay, let's look at what the syllabus says before we continue. It's a very short couple of sentences, but it says that you need to look at, first of all, international efforts and conferences to address mitigation and adaptation strategies. And then it gives us those 3 examples that I've already said. It doesn't specifically mention Kyoto or Paris, but I think they are kind of the bedrock of current international agreements and legislation of how we're going to deal with climate change, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation. And then in terms of adaptations and skills, it says we need to evaluate the effectiveness of these international climate change talks. Well, I'll give you the content and we'll talk about what these international agreements actually are. And I think we'll leave the evaluations to when we discuss this in the classroom, as usual. Okay, so let's move swiftly on again. We'll start by talking about Kyoto. It was signed in 1997. I'm old enough to remember I was actually working in my first job as an environmental consultant then, actually in 1997. So I remember it well. At the time, 183 countries signed. More have joined since. I think it's above 190 at the moment. And there was a period of grace between 1997 and 2005 when it came into force. Well, I say it came into force, but you have to remember that the United Nations doesn't have any way to force countries that have actually signed the agreement to actually put into practice what they've agreed, and many countries actually didn't. So therefore, that led to other agreements, including Paris, which came later. One of the bedrocks of the agreement was the idea of carbon credits. And this was the idea that any country could basically continue to produce and put greenhouse gases into the atmosphere as long as, in consequence, they bought carbon credits to enable them to do this, which paid for things like afforestation in LEDCs to offset the carbon that was produced. It was a good idea in principle, and the idea was to reward countries for, especially LEDCs, for efforts to reduce carbon in the atmosphere, as well as to try not to have a huge economic effect on countries that continue to pollute. In the end, however, there were a series of problems. First of all, Bill Clinton's government signed the Kyoto Protocol, but the incoming government of George Bush Jr. refused to ratify it. That was really a response because the US saw LEDCs, especially China, who didn't have such stringent agreements to meet, as having an economic advantage as a result. You might see a parallel there with what Donald Trump has done with the Paris Agreement. In consequence of the United States pulling out of the agreement, Canada refused to ratify as well, which was a shame. So from the start, Kyoto had a number of problems, and you could say it was even beset by the tragedy of the commons, the point that some countries refused to ratify because they saw short-term benefits for themselves as opposed to the long-term benefits of the whole world. Okay. So, in consequence, what I should say before we talk about Paris, there was another agreement in 2012, which was a follow-up from Kyoto, which was signed in Doha, and obviously it was therefore called the Doha Agreement. And it was the 2012 effort to see where countries currently lay with regards to meeting the requirements of the Kyoto Protocol. It was a very fractious meeting, a lot of problems. The targets were more or less renegotiated or reapplied, and it was a chance to kind of set the reset button between 2013 and 2020. In effect, it wasn't that successful. But one thing that Doha Agreement did establish was some strategies for adaptation. It was called the Kyoto Adaptation Fund. What that meant was that 2% of all revenue that the United Nations took from carbon credit trading was given to adaptation strategies for LEDCs and newly industrialized countries. So that meant that basically MEDCs were paying for adaptation strategies like seawalls, technocentric approaches in MEDCs, specifically to do with adaptation to climate change. So as I said, in 2015, the Paris Agreement was signed. Paris was chosen because then and now really, it was one of few countries that is very close to becoming carbon neutral. The reason France was able to do that was because it's very, very dependent on nuclear power, as I think we've mentioned before. And so therefore, as a country, it produces very little greenhouse gases for energy production. So 174 countries signed up at the time. And basically, it changed the goalposts. Rather than trying to regulate how much greenhouse gases were put into the atmosphere, it tried to put a cap on how high temperatures could rise. And the agreement was that global temperatures should be stabilized by no more than a 2-degree rise above pre-industrial levels. 2 degrees was chosen because, as we've said before, it's seen by a lot of climate scientists as a tipping point. If average global temperatures go above 2 degrees higher than they were pre-industry, we're very likely to see these runaway positive feedback effects that will lead to really damaging effects on global climate. The second aim was to reach net zero anthropogenic release of greenhouse gases by the year 2050. It's seen as a big success at the time. The US signed this time, but subsequent to that, Donald Trump pulled out of the agreement, and that came into force only a few weeks ago while I'm recording this, in November 2020. It remains to be seen while I'm recording this video what actually happens over the next few years, both in terms of the US government and what Joe Biden has said about how he will put the US back into the Paris Agreement. Okay, so that's Kyoto Agreement, the Paris Agreement, and it's worth just going back and making sure you understand what I said about the Doha strategies for adaptation to climate change. Okay, now one final slide. So I just want to cover the other parts of the United Nations that the syllabus mentioned. First of all, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So basically, it was created by the United Nations, or more specifically UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, as a group of people that would provide governments with scientific advice and to push forward climate change research. They try to stay politically neutral. Well, I think that's rather difficult. They don't conduct research themselves. They just provide meetings and workshops and advice for all the scientists that actually work on it. So it's basically a meeting point for all of the world's most eminent climate scientists. In 2007, it was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize together with Al Gore. They were working alongside him. And they're just continuing that work today. So it's basically a meeting point for climate scientists. NAPAs, or NAPAs, this is the National Adaptation Programme of Action, also created by the United Nations. It was set up in 2001 as part of the annual meetings that the government governments around the world had following Kyoto. They were called the COP, or the Conference of the Parties. And it was seen as a way to support LEDCs specifically in adapting to climate change. So what countries could do is they could submit these action plans, these NAPAs, to the United Nations for consideration. And specifically, the United Nations, through this program of action, was trying to appeal to grassroots communities which could put together ideas and proposals of how they could adapt to climate change. So this is very specifically a program of adaptation rather than mitigation. Just before I recorded this, I looked up on the United Nations website how many NAPAs actually exist, and somewhere at the moment between 50 and 60. I think in the year 2017 it was 50, so I think it's a few more now. And those are LEDCs that have currently submitted the NAPAs to the United Nations for consideration. And then finally, the UNFCCC, it's quite a mouthful, or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This has more or less been superseded now. It predated Kyoto. It was actually part of the Rio Earth Summit, which was held in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. And it basically enabled the Kyoto Protocol to come into existence. It was the first global meeting where countries were split into MEDCs and LEDCs. And the idea of this framework was to give an obligation to MEDCs to provide help to LEDCs in terms of mitigation and adaptation. But as I say, it was kind of superseded by both Kyoto and the Paris Accord later on. And then finally, those are things that have happened in the past. I think it's worth trying to look into the future and seeing what might happen with regard to international agreements on adaptation. Well, I would say in future there'll be much greater much greater numbers of climate refugees, I would suggest. So by that I mean people in LEDCs that are forced to move or to migrate due to climate becoming inhospitable, the communities being hit by more and more extreme weather events, sea level rise and constant flooding. So we might have to see more and more agreement between countries to accept climate refugees, unfortunately. This is a case in point, these two pictures that I put down here. This is Tuvalu, which is a South Pacific chain of islands, very, very skinny islands. And they have a maximum height above sea level, an average height above sea level of 2 meters only. So if we come close to 2 degrees temperature rise, or even 1.5 degree temperature rise, it's likely that Tuvalu will be underwater, unfortunately, and it will cease to exist. I looked it up, and it's currently got a population of about 11,500, a little bit more than that, maybe about 11,900 at the moment. And unfortunately, plans are already in place to evacuate the whole population of this island to New Zealand. 11,500 people, not a small number of people. As far as I know, I think Tuvalu is the 4th smallest nation in the world, but it's still a significant number of people. And in addition, as climate change progresses, it's more likely that these islanders are going to be subjected to more and more extreme weather events, like cyclones. Bigger and bigger cyclones are occurring in the South Pacific at the moment. Okay, what else? Well, I would also say, we've mentioned this before in previous videos, as climate change progresses, we might also see problems of water availability, especially in already water scarce areas. So there'll be a need for MEDCs especially, to provide solutions to water scarcity and solutions to conflict that might occur around the world. Okay, so as usual, it's kind of a grim assessment of what's happening in the world at the moment. But we can say that these things are in place at least, and a lot of good people, a lot of good scientists are working towards solutions to the problems of climate change in terms of addressing both mitigation and adaptation. Okay, so that's my attempt to conclude topic 7.3. I hope it was helpful, and we'll discuss this further in the classroom. Okay, take care everybody, and goodbye.